Welcome to the Leigh-on-Sea History Channel, where we walk the seashore of the past. In his book of 1980, Leigh Parish Church of St Clement, Canon John Bundock writes, "The crowning glory of Old Leigh is St Clement's Church." This is undeniably true, and a video can only scratch the surface of its rich history. Canon John Bundock's comprehensive book is available to buy at the church and is highly recommended. From its very beginning, Leigh was a community split naturally by its geography. The steep cliff carved out by the River Thames created a natural border between the fishermen on the shore and the farming community at the top of the hill. On the brow of Leigh Hill stands the Parish Church of St Clements, dedicated to the patron saint of mariners who was martyred under the Emperor Trajan by being tied to an anchor and thrown into the sea. The choice of St Clement as a patron may suggest the founder had Roman connections, in common, perhaps, with St Lawrence in neighbouring Eastwood. Built in the mid to late 15th century, there is no mention of St Clements in the Domesday Book, but it is believed to stand on the site of an earlier church, possibly founded by the de Arpton family, who were lords of the manor during the 13th century. Pictures of the church prior to the extension of the chancel in 1872 show the east window is of the decorated period, circa 1300, meaning that some of the chancel was originally of that date, although nothing of that period now remains. The register of rectors begins in 1248, and the parish priest John de Havering held the livings of Hadleigh and Cresham in 1297. He was succeeded as parson of the church in 1310 by Ralph de Cokethorpe, all of which is evidence for a church that predated the present one. St Clement's is perpendicular in character, with a brick porch of the Tudor period, circa 1500, that was originally embattled. The date 1729 on the sundial in the gable of the porch refers to the dial itself, and not the porch. The nave, church tower and north aisle are the oldest parts of the present building, dating from the mid to late 15th century, and are all of Kentish ragstone, which local legend says was obtained from the ruins of Hadleigh Castle. However, this is only a legend. The ceiling of the north aisle appears to resemble the hull of a ship, and it has been suggested that the shipbuilders of medieval Leigh may have constructed it. St Clement's attractive 80-foot-high almost square tower comprises a basement and 3 stories topped by an embattled parapet. It has served as a landmark for generations of mariners and stood sentinel over the village for 500 years. For much of that time it was visible from the northernmost part of the parish. 18th century illustrations show a small cylindrical addition to the turret that terminated in a cone surmounted by a weather vane. This may have been a lookout for shipping, or perhaps even a lighthouse. There are 6 bells in the belfry, mostly recast, but originally dating from the 17th and 18th centuries. On July the 13th, 1889, a clock was installed, the gift of a man described as Leigh's chief parishioner, Mr. F.C.J. Miller QC of Leigh House, that once stood adjacent to the church. The clock was made by Gillett and Johnson, clockmakers of Croydon, and had 2 convex dials, each 5 feet in diameter, one pointed south, the other east. The north face was added in the 20th century as the town grew in that direction towards London Road. The clock had to be wound weekly until 1967, when an electrical system was installed. During the 19th century, this noble tower was covered in ivy, planted by John Loughton, collector of customs, who lived at Leigh House. The ivy was finally removed in 1930. Today, if you stand at the west end of the nave and look towards the altar, the arcade to your left dates from the 15th century. The arcade to your right was built by Ernest Geltart in 1897, when the south aisle was added. The nave and north aisle contain pews that terminate in beautifully carved poppy-headed ends. St Clement's was a fairly modest church for most of its history that served a small village, and it does retain some of that village atmosphere, despite becoming a town church in an increasingly urban setting between the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, when the current chancel, south aisle, Lady Chapel and Chapel of Resurrection were added. Very little is known about the early history of St Clements. It came through the Reformation and, in common with most Essex churches, was extremely Puritan. Leigh did not escape the religious controversies of the 16th and 17th centuries. In 1633, a physician of Leigh, named Fred Wagoner, was fined £300, that was reduced to £100, for his profane speech against the Blessed Sacrament. The theological changes during the Tudor era were no doubt of little interest to the seafaring people of Leigh, who would have not cared much about what was ordered or forbidden. For example, in 1585 their rector, William Negus, chose suspension from office rather than wear a surplice. An appeal signed by a great many inhabitants was sent to the Reverend Negus, asking him to reconsider because "we are deprived of our spiritual comfort, and if it continue it will be our ruin." It was signed, "Your hungry sheep." At first, this appears to have had the desired effect when the suspension was recalled. However, further trouble occurred in 1609, and Mr Negus was deprived of the living. Canon John Bundock, in his book of 1978, Old Leigh, A Pictorial History, states that this drawing of 1786 is probably the oldest illustration of St Clements in existence. The setting is entirely rural. There is no south aisle, the porch still has embattlements. It is the church as it had been since the early Tudor period. The artist was standing on the vanished Chess Lane that once ran west, parallel with the current Broadway West and Rectory Grove. Bundock dated this next picture as after 1800. Once again there is no Church Hill, and we see the eastern end of the vanished Chess Lane. This was how the church looked when Edward Newton Walter became rector in 1808. Despite being a fine reader, good preacher and polished gentleman, he was sadly an unsuccessful parish priest. This failing probably led to the following order signed by Charles B. King, the vestry clerk. To the Constable of Leigh, William J. Goring. At a vestry meeting held at the church on Monday last, it was represented that there was frequently disturbance outside the church during divine service. The constable was ordered to take into custody any person or persons either within or outside the church that may disturb the congregation. In spite of this, the Reverend Walter held the living for 29 years, and it was during his incumbency that the lady of the manor, Lady Olivia Sparrow, disturbed by the destitute spiritual condition of the villagers, hired the services of the Reverend Ridley Herschel to work as missionary in the old town. The Reverend Walter warned Herschel against entering the village due to its immorality, but undeterred, Herschel became so successful that 15 months later, when he left Leigh, 700 people subscribed to purchase a Bible and prayer book as a token of their love and gratitude. The Reverend Herschel, his school and house will feature in a separate video. This illustration can be dated circa 1840, following the restoration work carried out by Robert Eden, who was rector between 1837 and 1851. It shows the original medieval south wall and windows on the right. During this restoration, a great deal of tremendous value was swept away. Until the early 19th century, much of the history of Leigh had been recorded by memorials erected in the church to those who had lived their lives in the village. Sadly, many of these were deliberately removed and destroyed during the renovation. Nevertheless, Leigh Church still contains a number of interesting brasses and monuments commemorating the Leigh mariners of the Tudor and Stuart period. Unfortunately, no detailed plans or description of the Eden restoration exists. Philip Benton, in his 1867 History of the Rochford Hundred, states that when the church was restored, about the year 1837-8, the chancel appears to have been almost, if not entirely, rebuilt. It is believed that the poppy-headed pews were introduced at this time, and that in 1837 Eden installed the first church organ. Prior to this, services were accompanied by a small orchestra comprising cello, violin, flute and clarinet. The musicians stood in a gallery at the foot of the tower. The Reverend Eden would also completely change the layout of the village, and he is the subject of a separate video. Pictured here is the East End after the Eden restoration, but before the Reverend King made the first change to the original ground plan in 1872 by extending the chancel at a cost of £900. The left-hand window of the decorated period, circa 1300, can still clearly be seen. Subsequently, a great many structural alterations were to take place in the church where the famous Leigh mariners once worshipped. In 1872, the entire east wall was taken down and moved 17 feet 6 inches further east, utilising, no doubt, a great deal of the old materials. Windows were also put in the extended north and south walls. The chancel was also raised by 2 steps, and a low wall was built to separate the nave from the chancel. In 1883, gas lighting was installed. At the end of the 19th century, due to the growth in population, it was decided that a south aisle with a lady chapel at its east end should be added. This necessitated the demolition of the medieval south wall and the erection of piers and arches matching those north of the nave. Due to a lack of funds, the lady chapel was not completed at this time, and the aisle terminated in a lean-to vestry, clearly visible in this image. Prior to this, the basement of the tower was used as the vestry. Canon Bundock describes the design of the first phase as architecturally very poor and misguided, while lamenting the use of cheap materials. This might not have been entirely the fault of the architect and may have been due to financial constraints. Bundock was pleased that the poor quality of the aisle was realised by the rector Canon R.S. King, who chose one of the foremost church architects of the day, Sir Charles Nicholson Bart, to complete the work. Eventually, in 1913, the scheme was completed with a new lady chapel and vestry. During this construction, a priest's doorway was destroyed to make way for the arches between the chancel and the lady chapel. At the end of the First World War, a memorial chapel dedicated as the Chapel of the Resurrection was erected. Sadly, no medieval glass remains in the church, although Philip Benton asserts that as late as the reign of Elizabeth I, there were in the windows of this church the arms of England, Neville, Bohun, Ormond le Marnay, Rainsforth, Tyrrell, Berchier, Earl of Essex, Lord Rochford de Rochford, and Boleyn. All have long since disappeared. The Essex Puritans could not allow the heraldic glass bearing these arms to survive. The print made after the Eden restoration shows the east window depicting the crucifixion already in place, but with tracery at the top. The glass in this window features hand-painted enamel. This kind of glass was popular in the 18th century, and the glass may have been made in Munich. Sadly, the tracery and glass at the top were destroyed in a gale or by lightning. Although cracked by this catastrophe, the face of the Lord survived unscathed. Like the east window, the window on the south side of the sanctuary is also hand-painted and was probably installed at the time of the Eden restoration. It has the 2 figures of faith and hope designed by Joshua Reynolds. Also included in the window are the arms of the Lady of the Manor, Lady Olivia Sparrow, and the rector Robert Eden. Bundock felt that the 3 lady chapel windows are really fine, and it was his opinion that together with the west window of the tower, they stand out from all the rest. Our heritage is so fragile, we owe an enormous debt to those that came before us who tried to preserve the past. One such person was the Congregational minister William Holman, 1669 to 1730, who set about compiling a history of Essex by visiting every town and village in the county. In the early 18th century, he said of Leigh Church and its churchyard that it had more monumental inscriptions than any other parish in the Rochford Hundred. Fortunately, we have Holman's documents and those of other copyists who recorded the inscriptions and monuments of their day. It is beyond the scope of this video to list all the memorials that remain, let alone those that have been lost. These are just a few. Inside the church at the west of the north aisle is perhaps the finest memorial. It commemorates Robert Salmon, who died in June 1641 at the age of 74. Members of this seafaring family lived in Leigh for 300 years from circa 1450. Robert Salmon was the master of Trinity House in 1617. There will be more about Trinity House and the ancient mariners of Leigh in a separate video. The last in the male line of the illustrious Salmon family was a Dr. Peter Salmon, who lived in Leigh and was physician to Charles I. On the south wall of the Lady Chapel, a large tablet in grey stone that was once in the nave commemorates a hero of the Battle of Trafalgar who is buried in the church. Captain W. H. Brand was a midshipman on the HMS Revenge and served under Admiral Lord Nelson. Captain Brand was one of those who in the momentous battle of 21st of October 1805 so amply satisfied their country that they had done their duty. The mariner family Haddock of Leigh rose to great distinction and wealth, and Captain Richard Haddock, who died in 1453, is commemorated on a plaque in St Clements with his wife Christina and their 10 children. His son John, wife Alice and their 11 children are also commemorated. A stone with brasses memorialising Richard Chester, who died in 1632, his wife Elizabeth and their 5 children, can be found in front of the chancel steps. Chester, another master of Trinity House in 1615, lived in the house on the left of this picture that once stood on the east side of Leigh Strand until its demolition in 1940. Perhaps the greatest loss during the Eden Restoration was an oval marble tablet on the exterior south wall of the chancel in memory of Nicholas Haddock. Benton describes him thus: Nicholas Haddock, of an ancient Leigh family, one of the most distinguished of England's admirals, has conferred much honour upon the town and country. The historic Haddock dynasty will be covered more fully in the video Billet Lane and the Old Leigh Mariners. Sadly, many other unique memorials survived Eden's restoration, only to be subsequently disposed of. These included a memorial to Captain John Rogers that consisted of an oak panel richly emblazoned with arms and an inscription describing his exploits. This memorial was removed and lay with many others in the loft of the rector's stable. The rest disappeared some years later, but Rogers' monument was eventually found mutilated and defaced and being used as a cupboard door in a cottage in the village. In 1873, the King restoration necessitated the levelling of the north side of the churchyard, and understandably there was considerable disturbance in the village about it. Not only was this completely ignored, in the following year the south side was also levelled, but by this time the work was almost entirely met with appreciation. The ancient layout of the churchyard can only be guessed at from rare early drawings and paintings. In the early 19th century, Lady Olivia Sparrow gifted further land in the east to accommodate 200 burials. In January 1882, the churchyard ceased being used for burials, and the first interment at the New Leigh Cemetery took place a few months later. Both Benton and in turn Bundock give us very detailed descriptions of the churchyard and its memorials, but by Bundock's time there were no memorials of the 16th century remaining. However, there were many from the succeeding centuries. Today, the most well-known memorials are the First World War Calvary with its painted figure of Christ on a wooden cross beneath a sloping canopy with an angled stone memorial at its base. Remember, this Calvary is placed here in memory of the men of Leigh who fell in the Great War 1914-18. Their names are recorded on the screen of the Chapel of the Resurrection within the church. The Dunkirk Memorial, sculpted by Cyril Smith, was unveiled on the 29th of May 1972, commemorating the Leigh fishermen who helped rescue troops stranded on the beaches at Dunkirk on the 1st of June 1940. 4 of these lost their lives. Pictured here is Harold Graham Porter, a young naval rating, the 4th name to appear on this memorial. Another memorial is the so-called Cutlass Stone. Bundock felt that this tomb was somewhat problematical historically. No inscription has been legible on the top for a long time because the sandstone is deeply worn by people of the past sharpening their knives on it. More romantically, it is claimed that the press gangs who targeted Leigh's sailors in the 17th century used to sharpen their cutlasses upon it. It bears the inscription, "Here lies the body of Mary Ellis, daughter of Thomas Ellis and Lydia his wife, of this parish. She was a virgin of virtuous courage and very promising hope, and died 3rd of June 1609, aged 119 years. In the 18th century, William Holman said nothing about the inscription. However, King, a contemporary of Benton, mentioned the name Ellis in connection with this tomb. It was the London Chronicle newspaper of May 15, 1794, that printed the inscription, said to be found in the churchyard at Leigh. They did not say who saw the tomb. Bundock felt that William Holman would not have missed the inscription, and he saw the tomb 50 years before the London Chronicle printed their article. Unfortunately, the burial records for the period in question are missing. So we are left with Mary Ellis, aged 119, and what Bundock called a pretty story. And here we end our story of this pretty little Leigh church that has so many tales to tell.